Hi, students. Well, we are about to begin the lecture for week 3. We're going to divide it into 3 parts, a little bit of an introduction, and then some talk about the Old Testament and some talk about the New Testament. Specifically, the books of Luke and Acts, as we've already scoped out that that's going to be the main place that we go to for our New Testament conversation. So this week we're talking about compassion as a topic for biblical consideration for nursing practice. And I want to try to talk to you a little bit about compassion in the scriptures and see if there are some places where there is interface, if not overlap, actually, with what you do in your practice areas. So, what is compassion? Well, we know it's a feeling, right? We know that this is an emotion very often that we experience, that we demonstrate. We sometimes know it by experience better than we can actually define it, right? This person was so compassionate. That person seemed to really care about me and seemed to be willing to be right there with me in the middle of the difficulty. Compassion tends to be associated with difficulty of one kind or another because of the very nature of the word. Compassion means to suffer with or alongside. It is not a situation where you are necessarily removing someone from the situation in which they live, but you are with them in the middle of the difficulty. So when I think of compassion, I think of that kind of very literal kind of definition, that word for word kind of exchange that says compassion is suffering with, suffering alongside someone else. As such, it is fundamentally tied to the helping profession. So in my background in ministry, and to some extent in teaching as well, but certainly in the ministry, psychological counseling, family therapy, and last but certainly not least in this short list is those involved in the healthcare professions. These are helping professions, and compassion tends to be very much a part of it. I remember, actually, this was, my goodness, 20 years ago, if not longer. My dad was already in his 80s, and he had to have hernia surgery. His surgeon was pretty well known to be one of the top-notch surgeons where we lived, which was in St. Louis, Missouri. I think he was head of, if I remember correctly, he was head of emergency surgery at the top hospital in St. Louis, which is the Barnes Hospital. And there were 3 or 4 times that he, in talking to my sister and me about Dad's surgery, found a way to call my dad old. In fact, using some biblical metaphor, he has outlived his 70. Well, he's over 70. And there was one other way that I can't remember right now, but it was a way of saying, hey, your dad's old, right? And I'm like, yeah, we get that. We probably are more well aware of that than you are at this point. But it was in that moment that I say, well, here really is someone who has a reputation of being very good in their practice area, but was not the most compassionate person you'll ever meet. And I'm not sure that's what we wanted from a surgeon. We wanted competence more than compassion, I guess. But a little compassion wouldn't have been bad either, because any, surgical procedure when you're in your 80s, at least as family members and those outside the medical arena, we weren't particularly comfortable with that. Understood it needed to be done, but we weren't particularly comfortable. And so the lack of compassion, that's another thing. Sometimes we know compassion by the lack thereof. And that's what we experienced then. And I guess I want to make sure that when I deal with people, especially when people are in times fraught with difficulty and fear, I want to try to remember to put myself in their shoes, to be with them in the moment, and not necessarily to focus on having all of the answers for them, especially when you've got a very difficult situation that they're dealing with. Um, Sometimes people look to you for the answers, and when you don't have them, it can be a difficult thing to admit. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to turn out. But neither do you want to make promises that you can't keep. So that's, I guess, another thing about compassion, right? It seems to be kind of walking the razor's edge between truthfulness and hopefulness, and sometimes those two things seem like they are worlds apart from one another. Another kind of thought about compassion from my angle: compassion is not limited to sympathy. Sympathy, in terms of the way I use the word. Now, in some ways, sympathy, more from the Greek, compassion more from the Latin, would be similar words, but that's not how we use them. So there are definitions that words denote, in which case compassion and sympathy might be very similar to one another, but then there are ways in which a word connotes or has the force of another meaning. So sympathy, to me, and very often the way I've heard it used and used it myself, has to do with like feeling sorry for another person. I don't think compassion is feeling sorry for somebody else. Sympathy would come closer to feeling sorry to somebody else. Sorry, I'm moving around so much, but I'm just jittery today, I guess. Sympathy is not necessarily getting in there with someone else and living life with them in the middle of the difficulty. Sympathy, to me, has a sense of still being a little bit removed from what someone is experiencing. So sympathy tends to, though it doesn't have to, it tends to have a little bit of a feeling sorry for them kind of dimension to it. Compassion seems to include that, but someone shares the suffering with the afflicted. Someone is there with them in a way that distance between the sufferer and the suffering with seems to be removed. So in what follows, in the videos that come after, we're going to talk about compassion. We're going to talk about compassion in the Old Testament, and we're going to talk about compassion in Luke Acts, and how that kind of perspective that a biblical scholar brings to the table might help you in your practice area, be it healthcare, be it criminal justice, be it psychology and counseling, whatever it would be, education, certainly, whatever it would be. How can the Bible help us think about compassion in a way that is both rewarding for us, but also helps us in our practice area? Okay, so we'll be right back.